Today's program is guaranteed to have application to every single person in your household. So get your Bibles, gather together your family, because it's time to begin Fabric of Family.
How do you explain? How do you describe?
In Him, all families are blessed. Join our discussion on Fabric of Family.
Have you ever found yourself reading through the obituaries? I heard of a man once who said that he loved to read the obituaries. In fact, he said that was the very first thing that he did every morning when he got up. He said, I just want to make sure my name's not listed in it. We sometimes laugh and make fun of death, but the truth of the matter is death and dying, that's a very sobering subject. In fact, when someone dies, the deceased is bound to leave a trail of tears behind where others are grieving over the loss of that loved one. Though death is as natural as life itself, its impact upon the family is just as consequential as the birth of a new child. You see, relationships are changed and things are no longer the same. God gave mankind a process to cope with such life-altering changes. We call the process grieving. It is something that helps us to deal with the aftermath of losing something that is so precious to us. And so in today's program, we're going to talk about facing the aftermath of grief. We hope that you'll stay with us for our discussion today. Hi, welcome to our panel discussion. We have with us today two men who have been with us in times past, been very helpful to me and to those who are watching the program and dealing with different subjects, but they are back with us today. I want to welcome back Tyler Gilreath. Tyler is my youngest son, and he is the evangelist at the Highland Church of Christ in Dalton, Georgia. I'm also glad to have with us another evangelist, a man by the name of David B. Smith, who's a dear friend, and he is the evangelist at the North Hamilton Church of Christ in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'm sure if you're ever in the Chattanooga, Tennessee area, David and the members of the church there at North Hamilton would love for you to look them up and to visit with them for one of their worship services, as well as would Tyler and the brethren there in the Dalton, Georgia area. Two very good congregations, and I know you would be blessed in being with them. But men, we're talking today about a very sobering subject because we're thinking about grief and how grief affects us and the aftermath that grief can bring upon our life after we've suffered some great loss in our life. Why would God even make man with the potential to grieve?
God made us really with having ultimate choice. Regular decisions we make on a day-to-day basis, God made us with that ability to choose. And God made us with that ability to have emotions, I think, in order to drive us closer to Him. Think about Christ, and you think about what Jesus did, and you think about all the things that we have to go through in this life, and sometimes people simply give up. But I think the reason is sometimes they forget what is to motivate us in this life, and that is the cross, really. And when you think about what Jesus did on the cross and the sacrifice He gave for us, God gives us these emotions to help bring us closer to Him. At least that's what I would say to that.
David?
Yeah, I think it has to, I think Tyler's just right on target there. I think it has everything to do with the way God made us. But Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5:23, the very God of peace sanctify you wholly. I pray God your whole spirit and soul and body be preserved blameless unto the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Even though we have a spirit, a soul that lives on and on, we are not like God in that God is a completely invisible spirit being. He has no physical aspect to Him. He's not a corporal being. And so when the Bible speaks of God grieving, it's certainly different than the way that man grieves. Grief is connected to our entire being. It's connected to us physically. Everything in the grief process relates to the emotion, to the spiritual side of man, like Tyler was talking about, even to the physical body. And so even from a practical aspect, I would say grief is just one of those natural reactions that God has embedded in the human being to allow us to get over what needs to be gotten over physically and spiritually and emotionally and all that. Grief's just one of those processes that God has implanted in us to help us to get past that. Even people sit down sometimes and they cry about something. If they feel better, physically they feel better after they've cried about something. That's just part of the process that God has embedded in every human being, I think, because of the way we're made to help us move from point A to point B and hopefully be better as a result of that.
You know, when I think about what both of you have said, I think about some of my own childhood experiences, and I think about my grandmother and how that she used to love to cook turnip greens. And I don't know if you've ever been around turnip greens when they're cooking, but they don't necessarily smell all that great while they're cooking, but they sure are good to eat. But she used to cook these turnip greens with something that was called a pressure cooker. And the pressure would begin to build up within that pot that had a lid, and it was attached where the steam could not get out until it reached a certain point. But once the pressure got to a certain point, there was something on the top of the pot known as a pressure relief valve, and the pressure was allowed to exit out of the pot. Now, if there was no pressure relief valve, then we could only assume that the pressure would get so great that eventually the pot itself would explode. You see, we see the value in letting pressure out when it builds up in something like a pot. And then we think about our Heavenly Father, our Creator, and certainly we can see the great value in Him providing us a means to let out the pressure, if you will, that can well within us because of unhappiness. You know, there are certainly many specific things that cause different individuals to grieve. And our subject today, when we're talking about grief, is not per se intended to focus simply in on one area of life in which someone may grieve, though we may use some examples of that. But there are a number of things in general that really all men have in common when it comes to grief. I'd like for us just to explore that for just a moment and to get some of your ideas concerning some common areas of grief that all men share.
I would say, I would go back to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to be born. Sometimes, you know, young babies die for whatever reason. And certainly when a family loses a child that is unborn or recently born, that's a time to grieve. That's a time to cry. And he says here, a time to die. When we lose loved ones, we grieve. I think back to Jesus when he was standing there in the presence of a dead Lazarus. He wept. And that's, of course, the shortest verse of all of the Bible, but yet it's one of the biggest verses in the fact that it shows us that our Lord had these emotions in His life. So back to Ecclesiastes, there's a time to be born, a time to die. And in verse number 4, it says there's a time to weep. And so those are some things that we can certainly show emotion when people die or when people get sick, when tragedy strikes in our lives. The Lord has given us these outlets to express our emotions.
Yeah, and we say grief, and our first thought is we run to death, and of course that stimulates so much grief on the part of every human being. But we ought not limit it just to that, because other issues in life cause grief, maybe not to the same extent or to the same measure as death does. But I was thinking, as Steyer was talking, there's a statement in Genesis 26, verse 34, where it says, Esau was 40 years old. He took to wife Judith, the daughter of Bera the Hittite, and Bashemath, the daughter of Elon, which was a grief of mine unto Isaac and Rebekah. So here they experience grief, but it's because their child makes the wrong decision. Their child makes a decision that's going to impact the rest of his life. And so that happens when people make the wrong choices, and we know what choice they ought to make, or God tells us what choice they ought to make, and they make the wrong decision. That's grief when we know that people are injuring themselves. Not long ago, I know a man that went through the grief of the destruction of his marriage. He found out his wife was committing adultery, and I mean, he was destroyed. I don't remember a single time when we talked on the phone that he didn't just cry for minutes and minutes and minutes on end, because he was just emotionally destroyed over what had transpired. So that can cause grief. Tyler mentioned Ecclesiastes. There's a statement by Solomon in chapter 7 where he says, I find more bitter than death the snares of a woman. So here again it goes back to this idea that sometimes wrong choices in life lead us to a certain type of grief anyway. So grief occurs when something tragic happens. It could be tragedy of a wrong choice. It could be the tragedy of death. Paul, I think perhaps the hardest words he ever had to write. In 2 Timothy 4 verse 10, he says, Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world. That's one of his best friends. And so I have no doubt Paul grieved over that. I have no doubt, in my mind, I can see Paul sitting down just weeping over the fact that he lost a dear friend like Demas. That hurts. So grief is not limited just to death. It extends to a lot of things in life that impact us as emotionally perhaps as death does. Yeah.
Well, is there a right way and a wrong way to cope with grief? I mean, does the Bible give us any advice along that line? Or?
Well, I came across an article that was written by a well-known psychologist, William Warden, and he gave several suggestions for those who are dealing with grief, specifically when it comes to losing a loved one. Here's what he said on this. He said, number one, we need to accept the reality of the loss. And I think, we all go through a time where we are in that denial stage where we have a hard time accepting this, but there should come a time where we need to at least initially, accept the loss that we have gone through. And those who refuse to accept the loss, they have a hard time moving on past that.
They stay stuck in
Yeah, they
grief.
stay stuck there. And that certainly will affect, no doubt, your spiritual life, just everything. You can't move on from that. Number two, work through the pain of grief. And there are professionals out there who are highly qualified to help individuals who are going through a great amount of grief. So he's exactly right there. And he says, number three, you have to learn to adjust to an environment where your loved one is no longer present. And that can be a difficult thing. You don't necessarily have to move out of the house that you lived in for 50 years, but
but sometimes, an individual may say, well, I'm going to take all the pictures down of my loved one who's passed away. I just can't bear to look upon that person anymore. And though we can understand the great pain that one may feel as they're struggling and trying to deal with this great loss in their life, you've got to be able to face the reality of what he is. And eventually you're going to have to come back and deal with that, or it's going to continue to be there. Go ahead.
And another way of moving on with your life, at least according to this well-known psychologist, is to reinvest in other relationships. We think about the marriage relationship, certainly that is the closest, the tightest, and there are a lot of other relationships that we lose loved ones in, family, friends, whatever it may be. But learn to reinvest in new relationships with other people to help you in this grieving process. And lastly, he has here, rebuild your faith and belief and values. Oftentimes when grief occurs in the a death process, some begin to question, why did this happen to me? Why would God allow this to happen to me? Where was God when my loved one died? Well, he was in the same place when his loved one died on the cross. And so these are some great suggestions, at least I thought, by this well-known psychologist to help people move on in this process.
Well, as we think about grief, the grieving process is different for different individuals. I just want to raise this question just to see what your thoughts are. How long should one's grief last? Is there a grief that is healthy versus a grief that's unhealthy as far as how long one grieves?
Well, and I'm glad you brought up the point about it being highly individual, because as Tyler was speaking, I thought, a lot of people have a preconception of how we are supposed to grieve, and the problem is we try to fit ourselves into a mold that may not work for us when it comes to the grief process. Now, I think your question is good. There obviously is an extent placed on the amount of grief a person experiences or demonstrates, but everybody's different. Emotionally, we're different. The way we're built. The answers are the same, obviously, but the way we handle it is different. And I couldn't help but think, some people may have to take down the pictures in the house just to get over it. Some people can't do that. They need those pictures there. So it's very individual. As you mentioned, as you asked the question about, healthy, unhealthy grief and the time period, I was thinking there's a statement by Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13, where it says, I would not have you to be ignorant. That is, I want you to understand very well, brethren, concerning them which are asleep, that you sorrow not, even as others which have no hope. And there's a statement about grief, and he tells them, while grief is good, you have to get over it. There comes a point when you have to get over it. And maybe the difference is certainly letting out the emotion, not bottling it up, getting over it. But when it becomes dangerous is when we are allowing ourselves to believe something that may be not true about something. We perhaps, are misinformed, and the misinformation is adding to the despair of the moment or something like that. So obviously there comes a time when grief has to be gotten over, because it may get to a point where it's almost expressing a distrust in God to be able to help us through the process if we don't rely on Him to help us get over it. It doesn't mean that we don't miss people that are gone or that there's not a void there, but it does mean that the sorrow stops because we're trusting in God to get us over that valley of the shadow of death, through it. So.
Well, I think this would probably be a good time to just kind of take a break with our discussion here, because we have a segment of Word on the Street with our street interviewer, Wes Ayers. And Wes is actually going to be interviewing a licensed professional counselor with the state of Alabama regarding our subject. It's a brief interview, but let's cut away to that segment, and we'll be back in just a moment.
We're here today at Heritage Christian University, and I'm talking with Rosemary Snodgrass. And Ms. Snodgrass is a licensed counselor within the state of Alabama. She's also a teacher here at Heritage Christian. She was nominated the Teacher of the Year in years 2007 and 2009. Ms. Snodgrass, I want to ask you about different processes through grieving. And I want to ask you, what are some things that you have experienced in your different counseling sessions that people are dealing with? What are some of the most common causes of grieving that people are going through?
I think most often we think about people grieving the loss of a loved one, the death of a loved one. But you also see grief in a lot of different settings regarding a marriage falling apart, a divorce, even just friends moving, changes that may be taking place in someone's life. They go through a grieving process.
When you're talking about the grieving process, I would assume that there are different stages that an individual has to go through to get over this process. Can you kind of explain some of those stages of that grieving process?
Yes, there are different stages, and unfortunately they are not predictive that you can progress through them and not go back to a previous stage. Oftentimes the first reaction is denial, that they can't believe that this has happened, and they will go through that, just even coming to grips with the reality of what has happened. Anger many times will be a part of the grieving process. And another stage along that will be depression, and that's what we most often associate with grief, is we think about depression as being a major part of that. But that is a phase. And then there will be the stage where you come to an acceptance of what has occurred. And as I said, you may fluctuate back and forth. You may get to acceptance, and then something may happen that sends you back to anger.
Now, as a counselor, you're faced with many personal encounters, I'm sure. So how do you draw the difference between knowing that there are other people that need my help, and you bring that into a biblical perspective, and you see what the Bible teaches about helping others and being there for others and standing with others, but as a licensed counselor, knowing that you have some things in your own life, how difficult is it to sometimes separate that and focus on the person that you're helping that's going through this process, knowing that in the back of your mind you have things to deal with yourself?
Well, one of the things that I think can enrich someone as a counselor is having life experiences themselves. Not that you have to experience everything that you may be helping a client with, but pulling from those life experiences, pulling from teachings, from religious teachings, and just from those life experiences can help you help that other person.
Ms. Snodgrass, we want to thank you for your time, but if someone needs to get in touch with you or one of the counselors here at the Alpha Center, what's the easiest, most effective, quickest way to get in touch with someone here?
The easiest way is to give us a call, 256-765-7111, and we also have a website that is thealphacenter.org.
Thank you, Ms. Snodgrass.
Thank you.
Well, that was a very, very good interview that Wes conducted with the counselor. And we're going to continue our discussion regarding grief. And I want us to think about some Bible examples that come to mind of individuals who suffered great losses in their life and kind of how they approached this subject.
Two come to my mind. Number one, I think back to Job's life. If you look back in Job chapter 2, you see really in chapter 1 and chapter 2, he suffered a lot of things in his life, and he was going through a lot of grief. And you see here in verse number 11, three friends that are introduced to the story here. And you see that these three friends, they came to him because he was in a mourning stage. They wanted to comfort him, verse 11. And when they lifted up their eyes, verse 12, afar off and knew him not, they lifted up their voice and wept. Job was in such grief that they had a hard time recognizing him. He didn't look like himself. He wasn't the same Job they were used to. And we also see here that they lifted up their voice and wept, and they rent everyone his mantle and sprinkled dust upon their heads toward heaven. And notice, so they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was very great. Sometimes when our loved ones, or maybe friends or family, when they are going through the grieving process, sometimes it's best to be like Job's friends, at least in this case, and just be with them and not say a word. You know, you may be saying, well, what can I say to this person to help them? What's the magic phrase? Well, sometimes your presence alone is enough to help them through their grief. And the second instance I think of in regards to your question is David. Back to 2 Samuel chapter 12, beginning in verse number 15, we see that Nathan departed unto his house, and the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bare unto David, and it was very sick. And you see that David therefore besought God for the child, and David fasted. He went in, he lay all night upon the earth, and all the elders of the house arose and went to him to raise him up from the earth, but he would not. Neither did he eat bread with them, so he didn't even want to eat. He was laying on the ground. It came to pass on the 7th day that the child died. And the servants of David feared to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, Behold, while the child was yet alive, we spake unto him, and he would not hearken unto our voice. How will he then vex himself if we tell him that the child is dead? But when David saw that his servants whispered, David perceived that the child was dead. Therefore David said unto his servants, Is the child dead? And they said, Yes, he is dead. Then David arose from the earth, and washed, anointed himself, changed his apparel, and came into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he came to his own house, and when he required, they set bread before him, and notice, finally, he did eat. Then said his servants unto him, What thing is this that thou hast done? Thou didst fast and weep for the child while it was alive, but when the child was dead, thou didst rise and eat. And he said, While the child was yet alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, Who can tell whether God will be gracious to me, that the child may live? But now he is dead. Wherefore should I fast? Can I bring him back again? And then notice, I shall go to him, but he shall not return unto me. This is how David dealt with this problem. He certainly prayed to the Lord while the child still had hope. He didn't want to eat. He was lying on the ground. But when the child died, he accepted the fact that the child was no longer going to live. And the fact that he could go to the child gave him hope to press on through this time in his life.
You know, that's an excellent point that needs to be emphasized, that if one is going to ever get out of grief, if one is going to become unstuck, if you will, out of grief, you have to get to the point to where you can move on.
Sure.
And David was at that point. Now, you know, for others of us, if we were in that situation, maybe we wouldn't have been so ready to quickly move on as David did. As David pointed out himself here, sitting on the couch, that you know, grief is something that's individual, and we're different in how we deal with it, and we shouldn't ever try to look at people as a book and say, well, everybody's going to always do like this, and if you don't respond like this in this way, then there's something wrong with you. No, we're individuals. But at the same time, as individuals, we need to understand that to free ourselves from grief, not that we won't ever grieve or be sorry for some loss, but to where we can have a healthy life and function again, we have to force ourselves back into circulation, just as King David was ready to force himself back into circulation and serve as God's king once again. David, we've got about a minute left before our program time for our discussion is over. But I just wanted to see if maybe there were some mistakes that sometimes we might make when we're trying to help people who are dealing with grief, some things that we can think about so that we don't make errors in our actions towards others and really compound their grief.
Well, the worst thing that we could do, I think, would be to speak out of ignorance, to say something that we've not really thought through. We don't need to be telling people, I know exactly how you feel, you're better off for this. I think it goes back to what Tyler was saying. Sometimes the best thing that we can do is just to be there. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just listen, not say anything at all. But we can be like Jesus. He was genuine at the grave of Lazarus, and He was there. Even after Lazarus was resurrected from the grave, He was still there even after the fact in John chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. So let's just be there. Let's be supportive, and sometimes just not say anything at all. Just listen. And so let's make sure we help people grieving.
Well, we hope our discussion today has been beneficial to you, and I'd like to invite you as the minister of the Jackson Heights Church of Christ in Florence, Alabama, to visit with us at your first opportunity that you have. We're located at 1031 Hermitage Drive in Florence, Alabama. We're very close to the University of North Alabama football stadium. If we can assist you in any way, perhaps you would like to study the Bible, we have a free Bible correspondence course that we would be happy to send to you. All you have to do is let us know. And so until next time, I'm Barry Gilreath, your host for Fabric of Family, wishing you a great week.